Copenhagen has a global reputation for being bike-friendly. But this does not mean that the cycling facilities have been easy to come by. They are in fact the result of a long political struggle. For the new Nordic Lexicon films, students asked researchers to talk about an object, book or place that represents their research. Natalie Gulsrud, Associate Professor at the University of Copenhagen, chose the bicycle. To Natalie, it represents her research in the governance of urban green infrastructure.
I actually came to Copenhagen because of bikes. Yeah. So I did my master's degree at the University of Washington, and I was focused on public policy and specifically how to realize the sustainable city with bikes in focus.
Natalie was interviewed for a New Nordic Lexicon podcast by Gaita Gamba from the University of Helsinki and Jasmine Adolf from the University of Södertörn.
How would you say have cities changed? Because there are always new events happening.
Yeah, absolutely. So we can talk about waves of planning for bicycling in Copenhagen. If we go back to the beginning of the late 19th, 20th century, we can see that bicycling was taking off kind of a global north scale. Lots of wealthy people had bicycles and were riding them everywhere. And what's unique about the Danish case is that first and foremost, there's a tradition of kind of collective decision-making. So the conflicts between motorists, as cars came on the roads, and bicyclists became apparent right away. So the motorist organization, together with engineers and together with the cyclist organization, came up with a compromise and said, okay, we need to have infrastructure for everybody. And so in the 1920s and the 1930s, it became law to actually build bicycle infrastructure alongside new roadways. The second kind of interesting thing about the Danish case is that Denmark has never produced cars. So we didn't have a car lobby to kind of put cars forward. If we look at the Swedish case, if we look at the German case, if we look at especially at the American case, the car lobby ran over every other voice, literally, in the course of the early 20th century to pave the way for cars as being the best form of transportation and taking up all kind of public space, pushing people underground in metros to make the car more efficient on ground. We don't see that happening in a Danish context, and specifically in a Copenhagen context.
Was there also reluctance in Copenhagen, for example, when the city was developing as a bicycling-friendly city?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's been times of expansion and of retraction. So we saw a lot of expansion until World War II in the core of the city in terms of bicycle infrastructure. And if we move then into a post-World War era, the post-World War city became much more car-oriented. There's famous pictures of sort of the center of Copenhagen being filled with cars, meaning that many people chose to live outside of the core of the city. There were a lot of industrial processes that occurred in the city, and there were students, poorer people, a lot of working class that lived in the city. Freeway expansion coincided with the oil crisis and energy crisis of the late 1970s. And at that time, there were restrictions on when people could drive their cars. And certain times of the week, it was only those who had absolutely urgent duties, such as doctors or police officers, firefighters, that could actually use their car. So citizens, there's pictures of huge protests at City Hall in Copenhagen where people are coming out and saying, give us more options. Let us ride our bikes safely. So we see this really grassroots movement. In the late 1990s, Copenhagen was almost bankrupt. Many people don't know that. So a whole reorganization of how the city was planned and sort of what the core values of the city were took place at that time. And the bicycle city and the green city were core to that kind of rebranding and revisioning of what Copenhagen should be, both as kind of like an entrepreneurial brand, green brand to attract people, but also as a very functional kind of way of getting through the city in a more environmentally friendly way. So the Copenhagen that we know today is a process, a historic process around decision-making, and actually has to do with the fact that citizens in the late 70s, 80s, and 90s protested against the role of the car in the city. The lakes in the central part of Copenhagen were envisioned to be paved over, and there should have been a freeway there. Citizens protested that and said, no, thank you. Planners listened.
And if we look at like cities like Helsinki, for example, that is governed by a government that is more like car friendly, would you have any sorts of ideas to make these cities that are a bit less aware or less oriented towards developing, for example, the bicycle in the cities happened?
Absolutely. So what oftentimes happens is people come to Copenhagen and they say, wow, it's a wonderful place to ride our bike. We could never do it in our city. And back in 2019, I wrote a book together with Professor Jason Henderson from San Francisco State about how that is actually not true. It's called Street Fights in Copenhagen, and it focuses on the politics of green mobility and the politics of the car. And what's true about Copenhagen is that we have the same kind of struggles. Parking is a huge struggle. There are many people who have only a third of Copenhageners have a car, but that number is actually rising quite quickly because that kind of famous, expensive taxation of the car has actually been dropped. We don't have that high of taxes on cars anymore. So it's much more affordable to buy a car. And specifically, younger people are buying more cars. And we see nationally that more and more youth are driving cars and less youth are riding bikes. So there's a decline there in Copenhagen and in Denmark. How this kind of shift from the industrial to the post-industrial to the green city has occurred is very situated and really depends on local decision-making processes that scale up to the state as well. So how it looks in Sweden differs from how it looks in Denmark to how it looks in Finland or how it might look in any other place. But if we look at general trends on a historic perspective, we can see that at certain times in history, urban greening has had more emphasis than at other times. And that has to do with kind of the way in which the city, in which city planning sort of uses nature, or the role that nature maybe plays in city planning, if we want to put it that way. So when we're talking about the green city, what do we actually mean? The green city includes green growth. So it absolutely has to do with kind of economic stimulus packages, ways in which we can think about green projects is also providing new jobs, kind of economic attractiveness. And what I would say is that every city has different challenges, but a primary challenge for everybody is climate change and climate change adaptation. How do we deal with that?
When we talk about kind of the climate emergency and we talk about this tight timeline, we oftentimes can end in kind of dystopian realities, thinking that actually we will never realize a good future. But there's a need to look at case studies that are successful, because in urban decision-making, there's always conflict. But despite that conflict, we can still move forward with good solutions that really work well. And here we can look at Copenhagen as a case of hope. So despite the very strong politics of the car, we still have a strong politics of the bike. And we still have a really successful green mobility scheme here in Copenhagen.